Welcome to the HR Dialogues, a show where we talk about HR and the future of work. I'm your host, Dr. Dieter Veldsman, and today we'll be talking about a topic that's been relevant in boardrooms and team check-ins all around the world: psychological safety. What is psychological safety? How should we think about it as HR? And how can we help organizations and leaders build cultures where people can feel safe, feel like they belong, and come to work to be their best selves? Enjoy the episode. Welcome to the HR Dialogues, where we learn from people practitioners as they navigate the emerging world of work. And joining me today, we have Michelle Fields. Welcome, Michelle, to the HR Dialogues. Okay. Tell us a bit about what brings you to the HR profession and what brings you here today to our episode.
Yeah. So in terms of what brings me to the HR profession, I think it's always been a desire and just so much excitement for making the employee experience just a really, really good one. I've generally had really great experiences at work, and I want to help create that environment and space for other people. I've worked in people and experience for almost 15 years now. I've worked across different industries, different kinds of companies. I've worked in construction, I've worked in publishing. And before I joined AIHR, I'd spent a lot of my career working in the creative and social media advertising space. Which is very, very cool.
I love that and look forward to also you sharing your insights from different industries and different environments, because I think the topic we'll be talking about often differs a lot in terms of the context within which I work and the context within which I engage with others and the sense that I feel around how I belong. To lean us into the conversation a little bit, we know psychological safety is a big word that gets spoken about quite a lot. And what I would love to be able to do today is to cut through the noise a little bit and talk from a practical experience point of view around what you've seen, how it plays out, and what's been some of the lessons that you've learned along the way. And the statistics are there, right? When we start looking at some of the research pertaining to the importance of psychological safety, its links to people feeling valued, belonged, how it translates into productivity, into business results, and into business impact. But on the other side, we also see quite low levels of trust in a lot of organizations. We see a lot of people saying, but I can't speak up with regards to where I find myself and the things that really do matter to me. So, Michelle, to get us started, maybe psychological safety, what is it and what does it refer to from a practical point of view in the world of work?
Yeah, I think like your definition is correct, but I think it's very much evolving. I think the way that we work, and we can dive into this later, but the way that we work, the environments, like you said, are evolving over time, and that then impacts what I think psychologically really does mean. For me, I think it very much means now how people can show up in the workplace. So yes, it's about how they feel safe, whether they can give ideas or voice their opinions, but it's also about not having to mask who you are anymore in the workplace as much as you feel comfortable to do so.
I think there is can we call it the more theoretical definition of what psychological safety is, the ability to speak up, be in a trust environment, the ability to authentically be yourself, to feel like you belong, etc. I think there's the real practical part of how does that play out. And, to call a spade, let's be honest, in any organization, there's dynamics and there's relationships with all human beings between that and how that plays out from a day-to-day point of view. And I sometimes find that I think hierarchy very often and leadership and culture plays such a strong role in creating an environment for psychological safety to be able to occur.
Definitely.
And I want to probe you a bit, also being a fellow HR professional. What is our role? And almost to look at it, and I'm going to play devil's advocate a little bit here. Do you think we help or hinder psychological safety in organizations?
I think traditionally the role was it's HR's role to create that psychological safety. I don't believe that is the case. I think it is the leadership, it's the managers within the company who's responsible for doing it. Our role is to architect that. Our role is to create opportunities for leaders, for managers to enable psychological safety within their teams. And also to embed it in, as opportunities for psychological safety, growth within the employee experience. Do I think we help or hinder it? I would like to think that we help it. But I think you raise a very interesting perspective on it. What do you think?
So, from my side, I think we sometimes do both, right? And I think there's a very traditional perspective in the organization, in some organizations, right? Let's be honest, around the role of HR and what HR does. And I'll give you a practical example. My CHRO days, when I was walking with the head of employee relations down the corridor, people were like, oh my word, here's the person that restructures us and the person that manages us out. And let's dive into the room. So I think it does tie in quite a lot in terms of what's the perspective of the role and the contribution that HR makes within the organization on the one side. I think there's also a second part there that we do play an enabling role a lot in terms of what are the leadership competencies that we put in place? How do
Yeah.
we guide leaders to manage these types of environments and conversations? Love the word that you use around we actually architect psychological
Mm,
safety. But I think we also hinder it when we overstep our boundaries into certain relationships, right? So there for me it's that key component around that you should never own the relationship between a leader and the employee. You are there to guide, advise, make sure that it's fair, make sure that the right practices are followed with regards to that. But if we overstep, I think we do a lot more damage to the relationship and to psychological safety, or we flip it the other way around, that we become the scapegoat in things
mm.
that are not going well in other places in the organization.
Yeah, I totally agree with that, and like I think the way that we avoid that happening is also so much in the positioning of how HR is positioned within the company.
If the mandate is a lot more that you are a strategic role player around culture and talent and where the organization is going to go in future, these things become part of your responsibility to be able to architect. And I think it's quite a important thing for HR leaders to take a step back and say, do I really know what the mandate is? And is it my view or is it the business's view of what the HR mandate is going to be?
Yeah.
And that's runway you need to create. And leads me a little bit more towards the second thing I want to probe into a bit more. So HR itself often doesn't feel psychologically safe for a variety of reasons. And I'd love your perspective on how do we bridge that gap? And it's very similar to, HR for HR around who looks after HR in the business and the organization. And I think this links very closely with topics of well-being, for example,
Mhm.
etc. But how do we guard against that? Because HR in itself sometimes deals with the dark side of the organization for the majority of the time. How do we make sure that HR itself feels psychologically safe?
I mentioned earlier, I've always felt like I've had a great experience. So I think my experience has genuinely been more on the positive side. But for me, I think it comes back down to, I guess, my previous comment. If HR has, I think it will, snowballs back from if HR genuinely has a seat at the table or is genuinely making
Mm,
strategic decisions, then they are able to have those difficult conversations. A lot of psychological safety comes from the ability to speak up, have those perhaps conflicting or at least
mm,
challenging opinions. And I think if your HR leader is able to do that, that will then impact the rest of the team, the way that
mm,
that leader shows up to their HR teams. I think the other thing here is HRC sometimes too much.
mm.
And I think that's
Agree.
really, really difficult. And I think that is a huge factor when it comes to psychological safety. They see decisions that are being made within the company. They see ways of working that perhaps are slightly different to what they've either
Yeah.
suggested, what they've advised, and then their HR's role is then to kind of continue the positivity,
Yeah, of
out, the
course.
reality. And I think that can then become really conflicting for HR teams
Mm,
sometimes because you're trying to have an outward
yeah.
this is how things are going, but actually you can see sometimes internally it's a little bit
Mm.
different.
No, I agree. And there's a big thing for me, the past while, let's say the past 2, 3 years that I've really started to pick up on is around the fact that the quality of HR leadership, if I can put it that way, from a people leadership point of view, because HR is also a business. Yeah, we've spoken very often around, that HR is a business in itself. So if you run it like a business, what would you like the leader to be able to
Yeah.
do? And I think there is that piece that it's not just about what we do in the organization, but also what we do internally. Because a lot of HR leaders lead quite big teams. We
Hmm.
never do leadership development for HR individuals, or very, very rarely, if we're very
Yeah.
honest about it. Or they, oh, there's 2 spots left on the leadership program. Maybe we should give HR the
Oh my
opportunity.
gosh, yeah.
And I think that's a big gap that we find because then
Yeah.
you do deal with a function that does see a lot of the bad side, dark side activities, things that do not happen and can't talk about it either because it's
Yeah.
very confidential and private.
Yeah.
So, one of the previous guests made this comment, which was quite insightful to me to say to remember that 80% of employees do good work, want to be there, but HR probably deals a lot more with the
20%.
20% that doesn't do that. And I think it does play into into the general mentality, morale,
Yeah.
mindset of HR around how it's really going in the organization and
Yeah.
their perception.
Yeah.
Psychological safety has to be part of the way that leaders think about the manner in which they lead. And I get it that it's quite tough for a lot of leaders to get there, especially when you grow out of results focused, oriented environments. It's
Hmm.
all just about getting to the bottom line and proving the impact. So how have you dealt with that in the past where a leader tells you, I would love to create this environment, but I am measured on X, Y, and Z. And if I don't get there, to be very honest, we don't have an environment that I need to take care of.
Yeah. I think with that kind of example, it's yes, a leader has their other role, but this is still part of this is the expectation of them.
Hmm.
So I think it's about how do you support, guide those leaders to embed little strategies within their ways of working, their behaviors, how they engage their team. I don't think in reality, or at least on paper, embedding psychological safety is that difficult. Just a lot of people don't necessarily know effectively how to do it.
Mm.
So I would say then just making sure that you are really understanding the behaviors of your leaders, that they understand their behaviors, they understand the impact of that behavior, and that they can really, um, I'll use that word architect again, just into their natural
Mm.
ways of working with their teams.
Yeah, I like the idea of, because I think with a lot of these concepts, right, psychological safety, employee engagement, employee experience, very often they seem big, difficult, far away, don't know where to start. And I think it is our role and responsibility of HR to start bringing in those moments
Yeah,
that matter in terms of the leadership engagement so that they can also start understanding. Right.
exactly.
Some advice that I've given to a lot of leaders over the years is to say, always think about your relationship with employees like a bank account, right? There's certain things you need to make regular deposits into
Yeah,
the bank account. Sure, you're going to have to withdraw certain things at time, and that's when it's high pressure. That's when there's uncomfortable conversations to deal with. That's the reality of leadership. It's not all, vision, mission, where are we
yeah,
going, rah rah. But I think there is that idea of just understanding that frequent deposits builds psychological
yeah.
safety, it builds trust, it builds clarity. And those types of things are almost, I believe organizations run on habits and routines, and they run on cycles that we need to be aware of. And I think that's more palatable for a leader to understand. How do we help a leader to get there?
Yeah, I think it's one is the definition of the roles and responsibilities. What is it
Hmm.
that I'm going to help you do, and what is it that you're going to do with your teams? I think there's a lot of work that can be done by HR professionals. So again, psychological safety now versus before. Before it probably felt more like an isolated initiative,
Hmm.
whereas now, as kind of we've been talking, it is way more embedded.
Hmm.
So I think it's about understanding where are within the employee experience, where are the touch points that aren't just with the touch points between HR and the employee, but actually between the manager, the leader, with the employee, and
Hmm.
help them to create those strategies where they can build that psychological safety without even realizing it. It just becomes part of who they
Hmm.
are. I think there's also a huge role that HR can play here in terms of, you know, partnering with the leadership team, but also as a whole team, not just in on an
Hmm.
individual basis. So what the leadership team can do is learn from each other. We can showcase the great behaviors, the great things that they've done within their teams, but, if we're feeling psychologically safe, we can also hold up the mirror
Hmm.
to them as well and help them to understand what does make a great, safe culture, and what are some of the things that perhaps
Hmm.
don't, and what the things that maybe we should be steering away from.
And it does lead us a little bit into culture work, right? Because I firmly believe that psychological safety, to your point, is not something that stands outside. It stands within the context of the culture and the leadership that we want to create. And I think something that we don't do enough of as a holistic whole, and that's HR and leadership, is to own the narrative.
Hmm.
And what I mean by that is very often things in organizations are informed by perception, right? So think about the difficult situation. We need to communicate somebody's leaving, right? There's always these things that people say, this is what they tell us. But, we really know that X, Y, and Z actually happen in the background. Now, I know that you have to be respectful around certain things. I know that you can't communicate anything else. But the question we don't often ask is what perceptions do that create about what people believe within the organization around who we are as an employer? And that firmly plays into the myths and the stories that we tell. And I often find that that's something that we need to help leadership a lot more with in terms of what are some of the unintended consequences of the things we do and don't do. And then what are some of those factors and levers that you've spoken about that actually creates a safe culture? And what are some of the things that damages it over time? And
Hmm.
how we can create that self insight and awareness that, even when things are tough, these are almost our non negotiable principles that we go back to, call them values, call them, you know, the things that matter to us. It doesn't really matter what we call them, but I think it is important that we deep dive and make those things practical a little bit more.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think on that is like when we're talking about building culture, it's exactly that. It's how we do things.
Mm,
So we can define a culture as, your values or whatever, but actually it's the tangible things that you're doing every day that people are seeing, like
mm,
that employees are seeing throughout their life cycle. I think with the leaders, again, I think for me, one of the biggest things is I've seen many leaders who are doing everything right,
mhm.
but it's not landing.
Perfect point you make, right? In terms of the fact that sometimes it doesn't land because there is a context and an environmental point of view. If you are a great leader that creates that for your team, but you're operating in a very toxic culture, that also has certain implications. So I think there is this piece for a leader to also understand what can you control, what can you influence, and what are the things that, to be very frank, you're going to have to be able to deal with and find ways around
Hmm.
in order to create this for your team. And I've often found in conversations with leaders that that's quite freeing for them to know that it's not their job to fix absolutely everything, but these are the things that is important for them to be able to get there. Michelle, I want to shift the conversation a little bit because we've spoken quite a lot about the leader and their team, the leader and the culture. There's also a key reality that you've mentioned, and I would love to hear from some of your previous experiences as well around psychological safety for the leader in their team in terms of where they fit into and in that type of relationship. And let's be honest, right? At executive level, there's what sits on paper, there's what's happening in the boardroom, and there's what's happening outside of the boardroom and underneath the surface as well.
Yeah.
How do we guide that? Because I think that's a notoriously difficult thing to get right.
You're right, it's very difficult, and I cannot say that there is one perfect way
Mm,
to fix it. It very much obviously depends on the team. I think just the way that the team are able to engage with each other, how they are able to speak with each other, challenge each other, very, very simple ways. But I think this team, that leadership team specifically, need so much. We look at lots of companies that will go out and do leadership development
mm,
offsites and that kind of stuff. And a lot of employees will think, well, they're just going off on a jolly. Isn't that
mhm,
so nice? But actually, that kind of stuff, believe it or not, is extremely impactful and
mm.
it's needed. You really need to understand each other on that much deeper level. And again, like, I mentioned like holding up the mirror to each other. If you can't do it within that group, within that room, then how are you going to demonstrate those behaviors to the rest of your team? And
Mm.
I think what's even more important here as well is having like a common language or a common understanding of the way that we do things.
I think unfortunately things like offsites and the social events have gotten a pretty negative name, especially in cost constrained environments. It will be like it's things that whatever you want to put before companies do. I once worked for a CEO and he always made this comment, which I really appreciated. He always said, if you want people to work together better, you need to make sure that they get to know each other a little better as well. Because I do think that a lot of it starts with human to human. Who are you? Who am I? How are we going to make this work? And it doesn't mean we have to be best of friends. It means there has to be professional respect for the roles we play, what we do. And you need to know a little bit about me in terms of what makes me tick and what
Hmm.
motivates me and what I care about, I think, in terms of being able to make that happen. And I sometimes think, especially, there's this assumption that the more senior people become in organizations, the less importance that holds, and more because people are not that much involved in day to day operations with each other, that bond should not be formed there. And I think some of the exco teams I've seen that go and do the work, right, in terms of the deep psychodynamic stuff, in terms of what's our preconceived ideas that we bring into the room, I think those things are so necessary. And for me, they almost become more important the higher up you go and the more complex an organization tends to become because people there typically then bring their stuff into the room. I think when you're
Yeah.
junior, you kind of a little bit more open potentially. You kind of know that you don't know everything.
I think there is this expectation, or at least unwritten expectation, that you do know everything and you do have all the answers, and everyone's looking up to you and the pressure of
Mm,
that. But vulnerability, just being your true self, admitting if you don't know something,
mm.
put yourself in the shoes of someone who's watching a leader who says, I don't know the answer to that. I'm going to go find out.
I once worked for a leader and I always appreciated that from him. He was very open and honest around, it's actually quite a tough period at home for me because of X, Y, and Z. So I think it's influencing the way that I think about what's happening here or what this
Yeah.
specific thing needs to be. And I think that is really beneficial for these types of processes because to your point, vulnerability is not a weakness, right? And I mean, there's a lot written on vulnerability at the moment. I mean, there's some excellent resources out there in
Yeah.
terms of how self insight that leaders need to get into their own vulnerability is such a crucial component in their own development and maturing as a leader over
Yeah.
time. So I think it does place a little bit of a how do we shift the misconception about what some of these things are? And I want to build on that because we've spoken now also around the leadership team themselves, but context is still lacking a bit, right? In terms of where these things happen. I think especially today, there's so many different ways and work arrangements. So we talk about how AI is changing work. We talk about automation. We talk about hybrid work. We talk about distributed work, deconstructed work.
Hmm.
So how do you think that's influencing? Because a lot of what we know in psychological safety is very much based on a relationship driven between set individuals in a particular environment. But people are not working like that anymore.
No, and I think the hybrid nature brings a lot. So for some people who don't like going to the office, actually being at home probably makes them feel more comfortable. That's an
Mm,
absolutely great thing. But now we have so many different methods of communication. We are in meetings, or we are on Slack, or we are in the office and chatting at the water cooler, right?
mhm,
And I think what's missing a lot or the thing to be careful about with in more hybrid or whatever kind of different kind of work environments is sometimes it's what's not being said that we need to look out for,
mm,
or it's the side Slack messages,
mm.
or it's the people in the room are having a chat when the meeting ends, and the ones that are online have gone. But in this context, it's very difficult to then like understand a little bit around like what is happening versus what is not happening. I think there's also like when you think about um you know uh online calls and video chats, how many times have you been in a situation where people are accidentally talking over each other? The person who's the loudest gets the comment in, and the
Mhm.
quieter people end up going, oh, you know what, never mind, and
Yeah.
then the conversation moves on. So I think that is a huge thing, which means we have to be so much more intentional
Mm.
about the way that we curate and craft psychological safety. I think in terms of AI, this is also really interesting because there's a couple points on how AI is impacting psychological safety. One is AI is making us work quicker.
Mhm.
It's making us think differently. It's taking away some of the hopefully for everyone, it's taking away some of like the more administrative work, for example, which means that we're having to think quicker, we're having to develop quicker, we're having to learn faster. So everything is very fast. So actually, what it means is the way that we then collaborate, we come up with ideas, we innovate is so much more important. Which means we need that safety to be
Mm.
able to actually put those ideas out there and really challenge each other, because that is where the work is, rather than deep diving into a topic, coming back and presenting it, for
Mm.
example. I think AI also, I think I've seen a few of these tools already popping up in terms of how AI can monitor is the wrong word, how it can measure
Mhm.
psychological safety and how it can help bring out your blind spots. So I think that's also really interesting when we're looking at team dynamics, and how leaders can perhaps spot blind spots that they've got in terms of
Yeah.
their approach.
Yeah. And I think you make a valid point around the fact that, I think in call it the age of AI that we're moving into, I think there is a real need for what is real and what is authentic,
Yeah.
right? We've all learned how to spot the, AI crafted message type of thing. I think
Yeah.
it's quite an important thing around if psychological safety is built in relationship and it's built by getting to know each other a little bit better and it's built through building of trust, I think that there's such an important piece there around what is real, what is authentic, what do we
Yeah.
take forward. And to your point, there's prominence bias, right? In terms of, especially, I think there's still a lot we need to learn around real inclusive ways of work when people are not same language, same place, same time zone, same collaboration tool. And it's easy
Yeah.
if everybody's in a similar situation versus when some people are in different
Yeah.
situations and to connect that together. And I still feel that's something that we haven't quite bridged yet, even though we've been talking about hybrid work for many, many, many years. And I think that's going to be an important thing for us in the culture and OD and leadership space to think about in terms of really putting those mechanisms in place to help people lead in a different way, to connect, to engage in a different way, to build relationship in a different way. And something that you mentioned around the AI piece, I think that there's a very positive sign. It can highlight where these things are not happening. I think it creates a lot of good awareness about,
Hmm.
um, I just some of the tools that we utilize in terms of who spoke most in a meeting, right?
Yeah.
What was said, what wasn't said. I think it can really surface a lot of those insights for us to create awareness. I do want to probe you a little bit on the topic then of measurement, because what I've seen in a lot of instances, and self-report measures are good for some things, they're not for other things as well. But very often we send out the survey for psychological
Yeah.
safety, and then we go report people feel safe, they feel they belong, they feel they can
Yeah.
speak up. And then my first thought is always social desirability. Of course, people are going to tell you that. So how do you actually measure, and how do you know if you have a challenge with psychological safety?
Yeah, it's I think measurement is such an interesting and it's a difficult thing to do.
Mm,
Yes, you can send out your surveys. You can ask the questions. Do you feel like you can speak up in meetings? Do you feel like this? And that will give you some kind of indication. However, I feel like if someone isn't feeling psychologically safe, it's unlikely they're going to respond to that survey and say, "No, I don't feel like that," because they'll think that it will get back to them at some way. So
mm,
the effectiveness is really difficult. um yes, you can then add on, more kind of specific questions that are much more like around, do you understand how decisions are made, and kind of really dive into that a little
yeah.
bit deeper. But I think one of the best things that you can really do, and it's very, very broad, is just watch behaviors. Who is speaking, who is not speaking,
Mm,
whose ideas are being put forward? Is it always the same people whose ideas are being put forward, um, versus not? Is feedback flowing both ways rather than just one?
mm.
And I think those kinds of things will help you really to begin to understand where perhaps psychological safety is happening in pockets more than
Mm.
perhaps others.
And for me, there's two things that's really important. One, I think you've mentioned connecting the dots between sometimes seemingly unrelated things that starts to happen, right? A particular manager, whenever we do 360s, there's a certain theme that comes out, but they are also the people that X, Y, and Z happen. So almost to spot, can I call them the red flags of
Hmm.
psychological safety
Yeah.
across normal ways of work. I think the second one is also, and that's where I think tools like AI, etc., can play a really good role, is in terms of sentiment analysis over time, and to be able to connect, but what are some of the longitudinal trends that we're seeing that is telling a very different story than what we might have gotten out of only one survey or a
Yeah.
pulse that we measure regularly. And I think if we start being much more attuned to that, and also to educate people what to look for, same I mentioned earlier, it's like with well-being, right? You don't ask somebody, "Are you well?" Of course I'm well, right? But what are the symptoms that you need to look out for? What
Yeah.
are the red flags that maybe needs a further probe and a bit of a deeper conversation there?
Yeah.
And I think that's a key role we as HR professionals can play, because that's typically the domain where we will have sight of a lot of things that we can then bring into the room through data, being evidence driven, so that it doesn't become this abstract, fluffy conversation, but it
Yeah.
becomes one to say, these are things that's changing in our business. Should we be worried about it? Yes or no? And what do we
Mm.
want to do with regards to that? It's a very different conversation if you start incorporating this into the room. How do I know I'm in a psychologically safe environment?
I think it's very much around. I see when I've been working in environments where I believe there is a lot of psychological safety, you see people literally connecting with each other, sharing their ideas. You see other people lifting each other up.
Mm,
You see people from different departments giving ideas on different things that are not their remit, because they've seen or listened to something, or they've watched something that they think is interesting and they want to share that idea.
mm,
You've seen very constructive um, uh, discussions between leaders who are able to share different perspectives. That's okay if they disagree, but it's how do you move it forward? And I think just having that in a environment where people feel like they can actually say what they mean. I think where we flip over
mm,
is when people are just saying anything. And I
mm.
think it's, there's a very fine line. But I think when you can see that, then you can feel a bit more harmony. We're challenging each other. The business is moving forward. So a previous company that I worked for, about halfway through my time there, they introduced this thing. The phrase, "There's an elephant in the room," or "What's the elephant in the room?"
Yeah.
Well, so at the beginning of every meeting, whether that was like a small team meeting, regional, global, and even we ended up incorporating it into like training sessions.
Mm,
What are the elephants? What are the things that no one's talking about, or what are those big things that are stopping us or blocking us, or that are just really uncomfortable to talk about? And we just get them out there first. We
mm.
might not be able to do anything about them, but we're not shying away from having those conversations.
Love
And
that.
I could not believe how much of an impact that had. Everyone was just talking about all the elephants. Um, and it became really positive because it meant we were able to move forward either despite them or getting past them.
Yeah.
They weren't blockers anymore, rather than that kind of shying and shifting away from it.
Mhm,
And yeah, it just made such a significant impact. So
mm.
I totally see the benefit.
I love that. Give it language, right?
Yeah.
That's the key thing. And sometimes to do it in a way that that depersonalizes it, immediately as well. And there's a colleague that we have in sales, and I always love in meetings, he does this thing, say, but what's the question behind the question that you're asking?
Mm,
So sometimes to go slightly deeper and say, you're asking me a surface level thing. I know that's not what you want to know.
yeah.
What is it that we are actually talking about? And let's just call that out,
Yeah.
and in a respectful way. So, Michelle, from my side, a couple of things that stood out as I start wrapping up for us in terms of our conversation. I think definitely in terms of the importance of psychological safety, and knowing what it is and what it looks like in your organization, in the context of your organization,
Yeah.
size, industry, how you work and how you operate. I think we spoke quite a bit about the leader's role in creating psychological safety and creating a culture of psychological safety, but also the difference between how do I do it for myself in my team, the people I manage, the team I form part of, but then also the context within which I operate. We spoke also about the fact that how do we measure it, and how do
Mm,
we spot the symptoms, and how can we actually utilize tool sets such as AI, surveys, measurement in a responsible way to tell a story as opposed to just become a number with regards to
yeah.
that. And then I think the piece also there around that it has to lead towards self insight and self reflection pertaining to who I am, what am I looking for in an employer, and what is the type of environment that we are providing with regards to that. Last question from my side, advice to HR professionals listening today. If you are in an environment, you might be in an environment that is psychologically safe or not. How do I get started and take what we've spoken about today into my day to day work?
Yeah, it's a really great question. Couple of things that come to mind straight away. So, one is check in on HR yourself. Are you feeling
Mm,
psychologically safe? Because you are responsible for helping to guide and maintain the rest of the culture. Check in on yourself first. Do you have that feeling? And if not, maybe address that first, so then you feel
mm.
equipped to address the rest of the company.
Love that. I think very practical things for people to get going on. Michelle, where can people follow you, get in touch with you, and with the work that you do?
Yeah, you can absolutely follow me on LinkedIn, Michelle Fields. I'd be happy to connect.
Thank you very much. And for those tuning into the show, we hope that there's some good actionable insights for you to take forward in terms of psychological safety and the cultures within which we operate. Please join us again next time for our next episode on the HR Dialogues. Bye bye.